Hello, welcome to Learning Life Podcast. My name is Tadisha, and I'm so glad you're here. This is a safe place where we can both learn and unlearn a lot of things about life. Let's get started. Hello, welcome back to Learning Life Podcast. I'm Tadisha, and today I want to share something really powerful. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Very powerful chapter. Today, I'm led to read the whole chapter, and I get such a wonderful message, and I want to share it with you. Okay, but let me first give you a little context. I think everybody knows the story of David and Goliath. David was the youngest son in his family's household. He was the baby of the family, and he was also the shepherd. He kept his father's flocks. He watched out for his family's flocks in the fields. Okay? I want to say this before I go any further. David is representing Jesus. If you notice, David was the shepherd. He kept his father's flocks. And in the same way, Jesus keeps us as believers. We are his flock. We are the sheep. We are the ones that God keeps. Jesus is our shepherd, our keeper. And so I want you to see the symbolic thing that this represents. David represents Jesus and those who believe in Jesus. Goliath represents the enemy and those who do what the enemy says to do. Okay? Now, this is something I want to share that I had never paid attention to before. And I'm going to just read one little part of it. Like I always say, read the whole chapter for yourself. It says that David was supposed to be watching the flock, but he followed his brothers, his three oldest brothers, and overheard a conversation that they were having about Goliath. And the people were saying Goliath comes out, scares everybody because he is giant and he looks undefeatable. He looks undefeatable. And so the people give in to the fear of how Goliath looks instead of having faith in God. So all the people run when they see Goliath. And so David hears his brothers and the people talking about Goliath. He also hears about the reward, which is interesting, but I don't want to get caught up in that. I'm going to jump to verse 28, okay? And I'm reading from the New International Version. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down here. You came down only to watch the battle. Now, what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. Okay? That was 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 28 through 31. Please read the whole chapter. What I want to share here is that Eliab, which was David's oldest brother, accused David of being nosy and not taking care of his job, which was to oversee the few sheep that their family had in the wilderness. He even calls little David conceited and wicked. And David responds back. He says, "What have I done? Can't I even speak?" It's really interesting to see this family dynamic. So David doesn't get caught up in the accusation. He listens to what's going on, And then someone reports to Saul about David being there. Very interesting. Then Saul sends for David. Now, this is where David says to Saul, I'm going to go and I'm going to fight him. Saul tells David, you're just a kid. You don't have any experience. And Goliath has been a warrior from his youth. And David goes on to explain that when he was in the wilderness keeping his father's sheep, that there was a lion and a bear, and that he defeated both of these and protected his father's sheep. And he says that Goliath is no different from the bear and the lion. So I want to break down two important points from this event. Number one, what if David had have listened to his oldest brother? His oldest brother told him, what are you doing here? You're not a soldier. You're supposed to be out keeping the sheep. You just want to see what's going on. What if David had to listen to his brother? It seemed almost right what David's oldest brother said. He was like, you're just a kid. You have no business meddling in all these adult affairs, all these things happening. You're just a kid. You can't make a difference. Sometimes those closest to us are the ones who can keep us from doing what we actually are meant and called by God to do. There's an old saying, they say you're too close to the tree to see the forest, meaning that sometimes when something is always or someone is always in close proximity to you, you can't always see their true value or who they really are. They're just a common part of your life. You don't notice them for who they really are. So that's what happened with Eliab. He just knew David as his little brother. He's like, what you doing here? Go back home. You're skipping out on your chores. But David didn't take heed, because by this time David had already been anointed, if I'm not mistaken, by the prophet. And so David keeps listening, and then he gets the attention of the king. King Saul calls for David, and now they get into talking about what's going on. And David says, I'm going to do it. He said, Goliath is no different from the lion and the bear that I defended my father's sheep from. This is such a powerful thing to see happening. Sometimes we overlook these powerful stories because we get caught up in just seeing the common, I guess you could say, common interpretation, or the common parts that we like to share. But there's so much more in this account. So the next point I want to add is that David said to Saul, let me fight. And Saul agreed. And this is where I want to make the second point. And that is David had to show up to battle because the battle was the Lord. A lot of times we as believers, we get caught up in what we see, how difficult things can appear. Goliath, he was like boasting and laughing at how tough he was. And David didn't pay any heed to how the enemy was boasting. David knew God, and he knew that if he came to the battle, God was going to give him the victory. A lot of times in life, we get so caught up in what the enemy is doing, what the enemy is saying, how the enemy is boasting, and then we lose sight of God. We lose sight that God has already won the fight. And when you are aware, just like little David, he was a child at this time, like a teenager. He was aware that God already has won the fight. All he had to do was show up and allow God to use him to take care of business. And the thing is, he didn't require the weapons. He didn't require anything necessary for battle. He only brought with him his slingshot, his staff, and it says down here in verse 40, he took his staff, 5 smooth stones from the stream, and his sling. And so I was in a Bible study recently. It was so powerful. And the discussion was about David having to take armor. It was very powerful. David could not wear the armor of Saul. Wearing the armor that Saul provided him was not from God. In other words, David was not to do like his previous generations and forefathers did. He was not to wear the armor of the previous generations. He was to wear the armor of God. I learned this. It was an amazing Bible study I learned this from. The armor represents the traditional way of doing things. And so David not wearing the armor meant that he was not following the tradition. He was following God. And God didn't need David to wear the armor. Why? Because David was called by God to take down this enemy. And so, in other words, it shows how we as people will sometimes get caught up in doing things a particular way. It's been done this way traditionally, generationally. Because God can do a new thing. It doesn't have anything to do with how things were done. And God can make things out of oblivion because God is God. All right? So God called David to defeat the enemy using only a slingshot. And so another thing I want to share here is that sometimes we think we need particular things to defeat our enemy, when it's like God is showing us with David. It was what David already had, the skills that God had already given David, the training God had already given David in the wilderness with killing the lion and the bear. It was what God had already blessed him with the skills and the training needed. But if he had conformed to Saul's way and wore his armor, then what could have happened? So David listened to God, and all he had to do was show up. In essence, it had nothing to do with what kind of weapon David had. And I think that's a major thing to glean out of it. David knew this was the enemy of God, and how do I say this? David just knew this was his assignment. He didn't have any doubt. He didn't have any fear. He just said, this enemy has defied God, and this enemy has got to go. There's so much to glean out of this, because another perspective is to say that a lot of times as believers in Christ, we become afraid of our problems, and we allow our problems to scare us instead of speaking the word of God over that problem, just like little David did, and facing the problem and showing up. Could I say something personal? Every once in a while, I spend a little time in self-reflection. And one of the things that comes to my mind is, how many times did I fail, not because I didn't know what I was doing or that I was ill-equipped, but because I did not show up to face the issue? I think you know what I mean. You got a problem, and instead of dealing with the problem, instead of praying about the problem, instead of seeking God for a solution for the problem, you hide, you run away, you numb yourself, you seek a distraction because you don't know what to do. And this only happens when you forget that God is omnipotent and that He has the power over every situation that we face in life. But when we forget this, we are like the people in this account. They were afraid of Goliath. All these people were afraid of Goliath. Now, look, if you want to do the numbers game, as they say, because we live in this day and age where people think there's powers in numbers. But if you think about it, if we apply this logic that says there's powers in numbers, then why didn't all those soldiers go and take down Goliath? Why? Surely 10 soldiers could have brought down Goliath, don't you think? Those 10 soldiers or whatever, the people did not have faith in God. They had more faith in the enemy and his arrogant boasts than faith in God and than faith in Jesus. But little David, just a little teenager, he had faith, as they say, faith the size of a mustard seed. He didn't care what he saw. He just knew that God gave him the power to bring down that enemy. He said, I got experience. I killed a lion and a bear. He had faith. That was faith talking there. Little David was the only one who showed up to the battle. Everybody else who should have been at the battle was too afraid. All right? Let that sink in. Let it sink in. So in the same way, when we have personal issues, problems, whatever, what are you going to believe? Are you going to believe what the enemy is shouting at you, constantly reminding you? You know something? As they say, empty wagons make a lot of noise. And so Goliath was making a lot of noise, shouting and boasting. The liars make a lot of noise. David, he didn't have to make a lot of noise, did he? He just went and did the job. At a certain point, he said, I've killed a lion and a bear, and I took the sheep back that they had carried off. He said, and Goliath is going to be no different from that lion and bear. David showed up to the battle in faith, not in fear. All right. So I hope this message blessed you like it blessed me. And yeah, make sure you spend some time in the Word. You never know. You never know how you can just get that revelation that you need, that answer that you need. All right. So please like, comment, subscribe, and join me again next week. Take care. This is Learning Life Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you learned something, that you enjoyed this episode. If you want to support this podcast, please subscribe. Thank you so much. See you next week.